Hello, precious students. This is Mr. Mulvena. I hope you're well and happy. This video finds you having a good day. Um, I want to talk a little bit about checks and balances and just use a simple chart to do that. Let's recall that our constitutional federal democratic republic form of government is one in which we have a separation of powers, a balance of powers. Um, no one branch of government does everything. They work together. They also check each other's power. They act as safeguards against one another through a system of checks and balances. And that's what we're going to talk about for just the next couple minutes. So what are these checks and balances? Let's start up here in the upper left-hand corner with the legislative branch. So everything that's kind of that greenish color is things that the legislative branch can do. So moving to the right, follow this line. The legislative branch checks the judicial branch, this pink box, by doing these things. The legislative branch creates lower federal courts. They set the salaries for federal judges and justices. They may refuse to confirm a judicial appointment. They may propose constitutional amendments to overrule Supreme Court decisions. The Supreme Court, part of the judicial branch, says that a law is unconstitutional. The legislative branch can either rewrite the law so that it is constitutional or even amend the Constitution itself, right? And finally, they can impeach and remove federal judges. The legislative branch can impeach judges and justices just like they can the president or vice president or other high officials. Okay? So that's how the legislative branch checks the power of the judicial branch. Now, let's stay in that legislative branch box and let's move down and see how legislative branch checks the executive branch. They can override a presidential veto. If the legislative branch passes a law and the president vetoes it, they can override that veto. Now, to do that, they have to have more than a simple majority vote. Okay? They need a 2/3 vote. They can impeach and remove the president from office. The House of Representatives can file and pass articles of impeachment against the president. The Senate can refuse to confirm presidential appointments, whether those are ambassadors, members of his cabinet, like the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, or Supreme Court justices. And the Senate may refuse to ratify treaties that the executive branch has proposed. Okay? So those are the ways the legislative branch checks the executive branch. Let's look at how the executive branch checks the other branches. Okay? So to do that, we're going to follow the line or the line out of the executive branch box. Here, these are the ways that the executive branch checks the legislative branch. The president may veto laws and bills. We've talked about that. The president can call a special session of Congress, telling them essentially, come back to work. There's stuff we got to do. And the president may and does recommend legislation. The White House has a number of ideas for bills that they want to introduce in the legislative branch. Okay? So that's how the executive branch checks the legislative branch. Let's look at how the executive branch checks the judicial branch. So we go this way, and you can see that line goes up to judicial branch. The president appoints Supreme Court and other federal judge and justices. Okay, those are presidential appointments. And yes, they have to be approved by the legislative branch. Also, the president can grant reprieves and pardons to people who violate federal laws. If the president thinks that someone was unjustly accused or unjustly found guilty, he can basically overturn those decisions. So those are the ways that the president, the executive branch, checks the judicial branch. The way the judicial branch checks the other two branches is really only one way. They may interpret laws and declare laws unconstitutional, which would check the power of the legislative branch, or the president may rule that laws or executive acts are unconstitutional, something the president does. an order he sends out may be challenged in court, and they say it's unconstitutional. So that was a quick 5 minutes on checks and balances. I hope that makes sense. I can show you, let me just move this one out of here. I have one more picture on this. Here's another illustration, okay? I gotta move this in here. Here you go. Same information, just looks a little different. I can see that you're having a harder time seeing me now, though. Okay. We'll move that over. We'll get that. So again, executive checks on the judicial branch. The president, the executive appoints federal judges, can grant pardons for federal offenders. How does the judicial branch check the executive branch? They can uphold the Constitution, declare executive actions unconstitutional. The judicial branch check on the legislative branch, declare acts of Congress, laws unconstitutional. Legislative checks on the judicial branch, create lower federal courts, move to impeach or remove judges, propose amendments to overrule judicial decisions, approves appointments of federal judges. Okay? Executive checks on the legislative branch. They propose laws. The president can veto laws. He can call a special session of Congress, and he makes appointments to federal posts. And we know the legislative checks the executive branch by overriding a presidential veto. It has to confirm executive appointments. It has to ratify treaties. It appropriates money. That's important. Sometimes the executive branch issues an order, but that requires funding. That money's got to get appropriated by Congress. Legislative can also move to impeach or remove the president. And something we'll talk about more, the legislative branch declares war. While our president conducts the war, the legislative branch is supposed to declare war. So that's kind of the same information, just a different picture. And now I'm over 7 minutes, and I probably talked real fast as I always do, but I hope you have a better understanding of checks and balances. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. There's lots of videos out there you can find on checks and balances. More pictures, more illustrations, if those are helpful for you, okay? The other thing that this illustrates for us is just how important it is to be involved in government, right? You may think, well, I'm only going to vote if, it's a presidential election. I'm not going to vote because the only people on the ballot are some judges. Well, those judges play an important role in the functioning of our government, okay? You might say, well, I'm not going to vote this time because there's no presidential election. There's no presidents on the ballot, just a couple congressmen, and I'm not really sure, what they do. Well, Congress, the legislative branch, has some really important powers. And who is in Congress representing you in the House of Representatives or the Senate is really, really important. And so when you learn these different checks and balances, when you understand the branches of government, you gain an understanding of how important it is to be involved in government. You also come to appreciate just how smart the people that wrote our Constitution were. They lived a long time ago, but they really knew what they were doing, and they put some really neat things in place to try and keep our government functioning honestly and efficiently. I know it doesn't always seem that way. Sometimes when just one party controls both the executive branch and the legislative branch, they can pretty much do whatever they want and maybe even ignore checks and balances. But for the most part, checks and balances has worked really well throughout the history of our country and our Constitution, and it's a really important concept that we all need to understand, okay? So thank you very much. Continue on with the lesson, and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.